Hey Gary, great seeing you. And
great to be here.
Welcome to Internext Digital. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Let's start off with an introduction.
Sure. So my name is Gary Reiner. I've been with GA for now 14 years, General Atlantic, which is a private equity group. We invest in what we believe to be high growth companies, typically minority positions. And we invested in 2022 in 09 Solutions and have been thrilled with the performance and the strategies of 09 since. Before GA, I was at GE for 20 years. I got hired in to head up strategy and M&A, and then ended up taking on a bunch of additional responsibilities that no one else wanted to do, including being CIO, but also coordinating a lot of our supply chain initiatives as well. And then before that, I was 10 years at Boston Consulting Group, which I loved to pieces. And at GA, my role is to meet with prospects, become one of the advocates for partnering with those companies. And then if there's a good fit and we do partner, join the board. So I'm on 8 of GA's boards right now, plus I'm on CitiGroup and HPE's boards as well.
Awesome, and thanks for that introduction, sure. Gary. Now, so you're sitting on 10 boards.
Yes.
Small companies, very large companies. Yes. But definitely what we've been seeing and observing in our client base is that supply chain has become a big board topic.
Yes, it has.
Do you recognize that as well? And what are you hearing from a board perspective when it comes to supply chains?
So supply chain went from, frankly, not being very much a board topic until COVID. And when COVID hit and supply chains were struggling all over the world, it was front and center, the single most important topic at boards. Now that supply chains have kind of gotten better behaved than they were, it is still a topic because people now realize just how vulnerable they are to disruptions in the supply chain, and that any kind of geopolitical event, any kind of security breach event can really put a concern on the performance of a company. And so this is still front and center a topic.
Excellent. And you already talked about that. The role actually of supply chain has expanded big time.
Yes, it has.
There's security, there's a geopolitical risk, there's a crazy amount of volatility, there's a lack of availability. Companies are trying to create more resilient supply chains. So that role has expanded of the supply chain itself. How do you see the role of the COO or the Chief Supply Chain Officer, and what makes a good COO?
The most important thing a good COO or a good supply chain leader can do is understand where their single points of failure are in the entire supply chain, and to make sure that they are not vulnerable to those failures. In most cases, the solution is to have not a single point of failure, but to have alternative ways to go. The ideal thing is to have at least 2 suppliers for every single component and every single activity that you need to have. In many cases, more than 2, but never, ever have one single point of failure. That is the single most important thing one could do.
Excellent. And supply chain planning is the core of what we do for our clients. Yes. And that's obviously an important component of sort of getting a supply chain that's high performing.
Yes.
What is your point of view on the importance of supply chain planning, and why should companies invest in planning?
Sure. The question being supply chain planning, why is it so important? And the answer is that actually supply chain planning by itself can't be done, without great demand planning. Put differently, if you don't have a really good understanding of demand, and how it is evolving by SKU, by component, you can't have good supply chain planning. So the most important thing, first and foremost, is to get control of demand planning, which means to have a very good sense of your forecast, and have a forecast, not just the aggregate forecast, but the forecast by SKU, by component, so that you can then translate that into the likely demands of your supply chain. Once you have that, then using real math, figuring out exactly how you're going to meet the demands that your business has. And it's not just making sure you have that right balance. It is sitting in front of a customer when you're negotiating a deal and being able to guarantee that customer that if they agree to work with you, that they will get their product on a certain date, because that is absolutely essential to our customers.
100%. And Gary, maybe a follow-up question to that. What we are seeing is that a lot of companies are still not great in demand planning,
Yes.
supply planning. Why is that? Sort of what is the hurdle that companies need to overcome to become way better in planning?
So again, starting with demand planning, it's a matter of really getting a good handle on what is likely to happen with our customers. And sometimes companies don't understand their customers and what they're likely to commit to versus what they're saying they're going to commit to. And so any kind of intelligence that gives us a greater sense of the ranges in which the demand is going to manifest itself, that's the first and that's the most important thing to really get your handle on first.
I like that, Gary, a lot, because you put a lot of emphasis on the customer,
Yes.
downstream in the supply chain. A lot of times when we talk about supply chains, people tend to sort of stop at the outbound DC, but don't talk about the customer, which is obviously driving the supply
It's
chain.
everything. It's everything.
So
Yes.
that also means that commercial and supply chain has to be way more connected than it was before. What is your point of view in connecting commercial and supply?
So if they're not connected, there's only one way in which you can satisfy customers, and that's by having way more inventory than you should have and that you could have. And that is a massive cash burn impact. That is a massive increase in operating costs. That is a massive concern around obsolescence, around parts losses. Inventory is something you want to have as little of as you can while still meeting the needs of your customers. And if commercial and supply chain people don't work hand in glove, the only way in which you're going to satisfy customers is by having a whole lot of waste in terms of too much inventory.
I like that example. Now, Gary, obviously, a lot of companies, they make investments in new ERP, SAP S4. There is initiatives around PLM, CRM, and so forth. From a sort of relative importance, if you would look at planning, CRM, PLM, ERP, how would you look at planning in that construct?
Let's start with what's the most important thing for a company to be able to do. Okay. And the single most important thing a company can do is deliver what the customer wants on time or even ahead of time. That's it. And we tend to complicate matters by expanding it beyond that. And there are companies out there that have shown what happens, whether it's B2C or B2B, when you perfect that. And we all know Amazon, and Amazon is one of those companies that is basically proven that if you meet the customer needs, and in fact, exceed the customer need, you will have loyal customers for life. And it's an example that many more companies are taking advantage of, but many are not. And so if you start with that as your North Star, that we will delight customers. We will delight customers by giving them what they ask for, either ahead of or on time. That's everything. If you do that, everything else falls into place. Now, the only way you can do that is by having great demand planning and great supply chain planning.
I love that. Now, Gary, you already mentioned that GA invested in O9
Yes.
in 22.
Yes.
Ever since you've been part of the journey, you're on our board. Tell a little bit more about what was the thesis for GA to invest in O9. Tell us a little bit more about the journey to date.
Sure.
And what makes you excited about the business problems that you solve.
So if we step back and say, how do we make investments? And I don't at all pretend that we are unique in this regard. But when we look at a company to invest in, we tend to look at three things. We tend to look at the first two things, which is the quality of the management team and the strategy they are pursuing. Okay? And in '09's case, the CEO, the chairman, the president, you, one of the great CROs of all time, fabulous. We fell madly in love with the management team here. And for one reason, you live the thesis that creating customer delight is your North Star. Because selfishly, you believe that if you delight customers, they will become advocates and they will help you both expand within that customer, but also deliver new customers. Now, that's easy to say. That is easy to say, and every company says that. Yeah. You do it. You live it. And you talk about it, and you have that circle that we all kind of pray to all the time, and it's beautiful, and it's real. Strategically, we've already talked about the importance of demand planning and supply planning. Yep. And when we looked at your win rate, when we looked at your customer list, we became quite convinced that you were the world class in demand planning and supply chain planning. Now, the third thing we look at when we're looking at investment is numbers and indices, but only to validate those first two things. So when we believe you are delighting your customers, and we want to know that, well, what do we look at? We look at your net dollar retention, which is the expansions that your current customers do, and we look at gross retention. These are very, real numbers that you have, and your customers not only qualitatively say they love you, but they demonstrate it in the way in which they stay with you and expand with you. And then we say, okay, so we believe you're adding a lot of value. What's the quantitative metric of that? Gross margin. Now, I know that sounds like a finance term, but it's real. Yep. It's what are customers willing to pay relative to what it costs you to deliver that. And your gross margin is very strong. And then we say, well, if it's so good, then it should be easy to sell or easier to sell, largely because you have advocates that are out there saying it. And I've been part of some of these sales, and I see it. I see when we're talking to a customer, and we say, you know what? Why don't you talk to all of your customers that are today '09 customers? And they do, and they come back and they say, wow, they are all seeing the kind of benefits we've been talking about. And so they sign up as well. And so, we see it in gross margin, we see it in net dollar retention, we see it in gross retention, we see it in sales efficiency because of all the advocacy that's out there. And then we see it ultimately in growth in revenues.
Makes total sense, and thanks for explaining it.
And if we didn't see it in those numbers, then we would question the effectiveness of the execution of the strategy that you've laid out. Yes.
Which goes back to the management team. So
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. No, awesome. Yeah. Now let's talk about the customer case. Sure. Gary, you're also on the board of HPE Enterprise,
yes.
Big client of '09.
Yes.
We're super proud to serve them.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about the impact that '09 had on HPE and their supply chain transformation.
Yes. So this is actually, as you said, board level. We discuss it at the board, both the people that are responsible for making the decision to go with '09 as well as having executed it. Okay. Now, the improvements we are seeing so far start with demand, as we talked about, where there was difficulty in forecasting demand at the SKU level beforehand, and they have massively improved that. As a result, the ability to communicate needs to their internal factories and internal warehouses, but most importantly, what we talked about before, the ability to sit in front of a customer and guarantee that they can deliver what they are proposing has made a huge difference in HPE's ability to deliver. Where they're moving towards is now even more capability on the supply chain side, where they're signing up their suppliers and they're getting full implementation in their own internal factories, against their own internal factories and warehouses, to really be able to deliver everything. But they are delighted with '09.
Awesome, and that's obviously, coming back to the point, customer advocacy.
Yes.
and that drives
Yes.
our growth. And
Yes. In fact, I reached out before this interview to the head of supply chain, and the first thing he said is, "Wow, we love O9, just love them." And as you know, he is an advocate and is willing to do pretty much anything for you.
That's amazing. Now, last question of today, Gary. There's a lot of people dialing in today that are sort of behind that planning transformation curve.
Yes.
They're not where HPE is today.
Yes.
What would be your advice to sort of get things going and to sort of get going on that maturity curve as well?
It's a great question. I think I'd start with the customer. It's always good to start with the customer.
I love that, really. It's a key takeaway, by the way, from your conversation, from the conversation so far. Yeah.
Start with, if you're a company, start with your customers. What do they need? Where are we not meeting the needs of the customer because we either can't commit or we do commit and miss? And then also, how much are we wasting because we have too much inventory? I'd start with those three questions. Where do we lose sales because we're unwilling to commit? Where do we disappoint customers, because we do commit and miss? And how much excess inventory do we have? I'd start with those three questions. And if I'm okay with those three questions, fine. Most companies are not. Most companies are not, and that's where I'd start.
I like that, Gary, because a lot of times we get feedback from companies that want to start, and they go to the CFO, and the business case, does not get approved because they say, oh, there's 1% in revenue, there's 5% in cost, 10% in inventory, but they don't quantify it based on the three questions that you laid out. And I think that makes such common sense. Start with the customer. How do we delight them? How do we deliver? And if we don't today, we have a problem that we need to fix.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Awesome, Gary. Great, having you at MTNX.
A delight.
And looking forward to seeing you at our next events.
I look forward to it as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stefan.